who is not a debater or anyone who is not a debater or a judge in this room, which means observers, please keep your microphone and your video off at all times. With that being said, best of luck to everyone. Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
POIs in the chat, please. Speaking in 3, 2, 1. Economic recessions are often long-lasting. They last 2 to 5 years and are usually underpinned by conflict as people are losing their jobs, people are angry with the government and how the situations they are in. We tell you that fiscal stimulus is a necessary tool required to push the economic recession out of its deepest dips in order to restore faith in the economy, to increase employment, to stop people starving on the streets and actually increasing the quality of lives. We tell you fiscal stimulus works best when it is used to aid in like boosting the economy further, as in like it actually employs people, it actually gets people like working, but also when it can be continued to be used over that 2 to 5 years and is not hit with backlash of people calling these people who rely on that stimulus as freeloaders, when in a world in which people can see that this is actually leading like that money is being used for a proper reason, that norm is far more weak and you're allowed to have more sustained fiscal stimulus. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, the models. Secondly, why this is better for the economy. Thirdly, why the narrative of free government handouts is so harmful on their side. The model. The model is simple. We think that the majority of fiscal stimulus goes to low SES people because it's these people that usually fuel the economy. It is these people that are employed in factories in the Midwest of the US. It is these people who are much more likely to spend their money rather than put it in random capital like stocks like that the rich do. It is these people who buy the goods and services, who buy into like clothing and whatnot online. We prefer a world in which the money that the government gives in order to like restore the economy is conditional on a few different traits. That may be whether or not that individual has recently lost work and is looking for a job. It may be if they're looking for a job as a whole. Sorry, it's whether or not they are still sending their child to school, or maybe it's they get a fiscal handout if they've gone and gotten vaccinated, which we think is a very important impact when you look at the rise of anti-vax in the US and other Western liberal democracies. So why is this better for the economy? I think the most important thing here is that conditional loans are able to fill gaps in the market that regular loans aren't able to do, and therefore allow the market to restore to equilibrium in a much more efficient manner. In their world, consumers who are poor and are relying on government handouts have a very low incentive to seek out any form of employment and I guess any form of vaccination. Because regarding jobs, often they are disillusioned by the recession. Often they have been recently unemployed and are upset with their managers. They've been laid off, they're pissed off. But also the fact of the matter is that by supply side economics, the government is going to give them that handout regardless. So they've got no incentive to work. And I think more important, no incentive to work. And they assume the government will just pay for them. I think typically as well, is that often the way government does these handouts is that they only give it to you if you are like earning like an income below $18,000. And if you work, that means your income can often raise, or your base wage or salary goes above $18,000, which means you only get that handout if you only get that handout if you're not working in their world, which means there's even a greater incentive not to work. On comparative, when you give you these loans, it is only if you are working, which means the government's getting much more bang for their buck. It means people are actively seeking out jobs. It means people are much more likely then to be employed, and then because of their employment, go out with their additional money to buy more goods to fuel the economy. We tell you that this is more likely to stop the recession at an earlier stage, because it means that firstly, there is an increase in consumer demand for more goods as consumers have more money and they're working. But secondly, it is much more likely that supply chains and firms will hold. Because if you look at the US, because of this broad-based sentiment, people actually don't have a desire to work. And what that means is that because people don't have the desire to work, the supply of labor force goes down, which means the average wage actually increases in these types of recessions. What that means is that costs for firms go up, which means, sure, they may be able to stomach out that recession for 3 months, but they are not able to actually resurface in the long term. What we tell you, when you have the conditional loans that people are actively seeking out employment, there is more labor supply, the average wage goes down, which means that firms are much more likely to stay afloat. You don't have all these long-term costs of restarting a firm in their world. But secondly, Speaker, we tell you that the idea of a conditional loan is a very good use of like getting people to get vaccinated. The reason anti-vaccination doesn't occur is not just the propaganda or the views that people have. It's because people can't be bothered waiting in lines. People can't be bothered, especially if you're poor, taking, I guess, like a day to try and get vaccinated, especially when the lines are so long, is very unlikely to occur. When you say specifically to those people that we will give you $1,000 if you get vaccinated, there is a very strong incentive for you to take that time off work to go and get the vaccination. Especially when you have so many, like you already have those vaccines, where you need people to actually get out there. And yes, there are anti-vaxxers, but most anti-vaxxers are probably weak-willed, probably poor, and will probably get bought out by the fiscal stimulus anyway. I think that's also a unique benefit. Finally, Speaker, why the narrative for free government handouts is so harmful. Understand, Speaker, in their world, people who are given these handouts are seen as leech of tax holders' well-earned money. There is an idea pictured in the head of US conservatives. The people who get this money are getting it for free, sitting on their couch, having a very merry time. And the reason it sticks so hard in the hearts of Americans is it's not part of American values. Americanism is all about the ideas that you work hard, you get your reward. But here are these group of people giving rewards for free, skipping ahead of the line for free. We tell you this leads to the rise of conservatism and populism, but it also means that it inflames these tendencies. So if you are Joe Biden wanting to put this fiscal policy in for like 2 to 5 years, it's very hard to do so when there is a rising voice of cries from the right saying, what are you doing? And insofar as Biden's proposed like a centralized policy in order to get some of like more conservative voters, he's not actually able to continue with that fiscal stimulus. On comparative, when there is a justification as to why these people are doing it, which I guess like moderate economists can like justify as being reasonable, that narrative is far less weaker. People can see that their fellow workers are being hit by the recession, but they're getting money for a reason, which means as a result, you can prolong that fiscal stimulus into the economy, which means you're much more likely to get out of that recession far faster. For all these reasons, so proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for the fine speech. Can we have the yellow whenever they're ready?
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
그 기득권
And 3, 2, 1.
hold on. Sorry.
Is everything fine?
Yeah, I think you can start.
Okay.
그거만 말씀해. 그 뭐지 그 프리웨딩에 대한 거 그거 쌈불을 한다고.
Okay. So a lot of the problems that the government PM mentioned isn't really unique to the problems of conditional cash to the unconditional cash transfers. But notice the fact that, for example, they say that it's going to be politically used, and for example, Republicans will be against this. But we believe that those kind of people who are against these cash transfer is not about its conditionality, whether it be conditional or unconditional, how specific it's targeted, but just the mere fact that the government is giving out free money, as they said. So we also see that the benefits that are supposedly propagated by the PM. When you talk about anti-vaxxers, or how about because people lose an incentive to work, say that all of these harms that they assert against us are ones that are very, very radical and really haven't proved to us. Then what's the unique benefit of this conditionality? Having that been said, I'll do the three things. First, talk about the quick rebuttals to the PM. Second, move on to the characteristics of economic recessions and why minorities and rural communities are important stakeholders in this debate. Third, about to our arguments. Okay, first responses. First argument was about the model, and then talking about how, for example, it would be about people who recently lose their jobs. So basically how specific it is makes the government more effective. We say that if we really want to talk about effectiveness, it's really ironic because all of the benefits that they say about how specific they can be. How about, for example, if a person recently lost their job, they're going to now be able to examine that. Requires a lot of MNE. That is to say, a lot of people who are watchdogs evaluating it, monitoring, and then evaluating it. We say that a lot of these it is impractical, but it requires a lot of more investment just to prove its effectiveness. Because if it is proven to be ineffective, if it isn't 100% proven to its promises, a lot of the conditions that the government just add on just becomes ineffective and meaningless. We say that fact, the very fact that if it isn't proven to be 100% true, if it isn't proven to be the conditions are fulfilled to its promises 100%, there isn't a really big difference between the conditionality and unconditionality. The only thing that is happening is more the money that is just used to monitor, plus the government that doesn't actually fulfill its policy promises. We say that a lot of the benefits that they talk aren't about conditionality, but more about cash transfers itself. Second, about losing the incentive to work, we thought that it was a very weak argument, that weak harm that PM identified, because we first say that it's very unrealistic to say that the amount will be so big that people will use it as an UBI to lose the incentive to work. We say that that's not the case for people, the very people we're talking about who don't have a day-to-day job and do not have a 9-to-5 job, right? We say that also, then why is that money? And we say that if you really think about a stakeholder, that's not a realistic picture. And they're anti-vaxxers and how we can prevent radical people like this. We thought that this leads on to our first argument about how it's actually infringing upon the people's will to use the money how they want to. We say that this is for example, in the cases of vaccine that they talk about, it's completely the right of the people to their bodily autonomy and actually have this very vaccines whose safety isn't really proven. We say that that's 100% okay for the people to choose. And we say that if you want to actually, for example, get rid of anti-vaxxers as a whole, then what about the rich anti-vaxxers, right? We're only propagating this policy against the very specific people, the poor anti-vaxxers. And we say that itself is a discrimination too against the rich people and the poor people. Okay, and then let's move on to the important stakeholders. For the most vulnerable people. That is an economic recession, right? And we say that in economic recessions, the inequality between the upper class and those who are less fortunate is even heightened. We say that that's the reason why, even if you say there's going to be a bigger GDP, for example, that doesn't prove to why the vulnerable people are going to be protected. And we say that the more important thing is economic security and people wanting to spend their money how they seem to be sued. first argument is about the harms of why CCT is ineffective, because we say the characteristics that I said in my rebuttals, because it entails the requirement that that monitoring and evaluation needs to be as happening as possible. And second is also about increased spending without the infrastructure backing it up. For example, you artificially cause people to go to, for example, more schools without actually having more school buildings, or for example, more teachers in that. We say that that number, if it suddenly plummets to, for example, 50 schools, and then you have thousands of kids who want to go to school, we say that it's more important to have a steady infrastructure investment that is actually more based upon what the government can handle. We say that this is actually chewing up more than what you can bite. That's the reason why we're not saying, as an op-ed, you cannot push us a burden and say, then are you not actually standing up for schooling? Are you not actually standing up for these benefits? We say that we also say that is needed, but that development needs to be more steady and something that the government actually has the capacity to handle. Second is about how this can, how their characterization of people losing money or just spending whatever is not realistic, because in the people who do not have a lot of economic security and the people who are, for example, in rural communities, developing countries, right? It has been actually proven that, for example, the UCT programs in, for example, countries like Kenya or Pakistan has been effective because these people use their money more on food consumption or livestock or education. We say that it's unrealistic, and even if it is, they needed to prove to us why it is likely to become these people spending their money in unnecessary things, when these people who are living day to day are actually more focused on their livelihood, right? That's the reason why if they really want to say they're going to be wasting their money, they need to prove to us on what they're spending and why they have the incentive to waste it. And third, which is our unique benefit, is that we say that the people actually have the free will to spend their money on what they think is needed, because the government cannot actually look at all of the households and the family's needs, right? For example, if you're rural, if you're living in a rural family, you might need planting seeds, something in a long-term investment, or you might need livestock in the short term. We say that the government cannot actually evaluate whether or not you need the short-term investment or a long-term investment, whether you need that, for example, a house, or whether or not you need a farm right now. We say that the government never can be so accurate and precise as the government wants to be. And most important impact is that the resentment towards your government will increase after this, because if it isn't proven, if you actually fulfilled all of the promises and the conditions that a government requires you, and then your situation doesn't become better, we say that that only increases resentment towards the government. Why isn't my situation better? Why has nothing changed when the government requires so much of me? So we say that it's a demanding government and a very ineffective one too. Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for the fine speech. Can we have the GPM whenever they're ready?
Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the reason why minorities can't access resources in some way, or the reason why minorities have a hard time, is because of perception, like the perception that people on welfare are freeloaders. Note that just not just targeted people on welfare, that target people from ethnic backgrounds that are perceived to always be at welfare. We address the problem that minorities face even better than they do on the comparative, because at the very least, we're combating the stigma that those who are taking money that was forcibly taken from you is not going to people who don't deserve it. 3 things, or I don't know how many things I'm going to do in this speech. First, I'm going to do some rebuttal. Then I'm going to talk about minorities and who get the better outcome for minorities and those who are both financially less privileged and those from like this racial background as well. I'm going to whip out stuff on economic, and I'm going to bring new material on why this is best for developing countries and best for them, and why it's morally justified as well. Cool. What is some stuff we heard from the other side? A lot of stuff about how this is uncomparative, right? Uncomparative, right? Because, for example, conditional payments will still be seen as a cash handout. We didn't say the problem that they're seen as a cash handout. Government spends money on a lot of different things. The problem is it's seen as a free cash handout. It is seen as money going to someone who's sitting on a couch, going to a kid who just graduated high school, for example, and can't be bothered going to uni, so he sits on the couch and gets welfare. Those are the perceptions that we are combating, because now the government makes it very clear that if you're not, if you are not looking for a job, if you're not making sure your kids go to school, if you're not getting vaccinated so we can get out of lockdown, you won't get that money. And that messaging is completely comparative, because on their side of the house, they have to give the money away for free. Secondly, they say it's impractical because it requires evaluation. Firstly, this is already done around the world. Government already, for example, welfare payments already require you to have job, require you to search for jobs, etc. I think it's particularly easy right now, like it's already easy, but it's only going to get easier because data analytics and the way we automate the information sharing process in government is only going to get better. So for example, when you go to get a vaccine now, you get an online digital certificate, which is very easy for the government to just attach to your MyGov account, whatever, right? And then track that and then, automate that. So that's not an issue at all. They say people will just they don't explain why they say we don't explain why people won't just use it for UBI right now. Once again, because now it's conditional. They won't get the money unless they look for work. They won't get the money unless they do the thing the government says is necessary for recovery, because no, government can't control everything. The problem with the US economy and the global economy right now is not to do with government policy. It's to do with the labor shortage. There are job applications open right now, but people don't want to work because they've had unprecedented COVID payment. So there's less people looking out for jobs. That's really bad, because now businesses are more likely going to go out of business because wages are going up, etc. Right? Then they say, and then they say people will still get resentful because they're on money, they're going to get money, but nothing gets better. Well, they won't be resentful because they're going to get money. So I don't see the impact of that argument. Cool. Who gets better outcomes on minority? They say that minorities are going to be affected badly because now minorities have to do things that they don't want to do. Minorities, obviously, firstly, I think both, let's put it up this way. Vast majority of people from a racial background, at least, probably aren't going to be dependent on the payments or whatever, etc. Or at least a lot of them are. At least in those cases, we help them directly because we have a quicker recovery, and there's going to be less stigma because they're still going to be associated with freeloaders, etc. Right? Those two mechanisms, a quicker recovery and less stigma, also helps those who do have to take those payments, because people who do have to take those payments are are going to face stigma in their background. It means, for example, they're less likely going to be able to get their local government to make sure they can access schools. It means they're less likely going to be able to get their state government to access schools, etc. It means their kids are going to be faced less discrimination in school. So in our world, they have better access to services because they have less stigma. Additionally, just because of the quicker recovery, right, just makes it easier for them for their access job. It's easier for them to get a high-paying job that they're actually skilled for, because they, but when the recovery, that business is no longer open. So the comparative is, on our side, we actually give a MEC for addressing the problems that these people face right now. It stems from stigma. We address that stigma. They do nothing about that. What did we tell you about economic? We told you 4 reasons why it's important why this reduces, shortens the recovery, right? It means it addresses labor shortages and vaccines, etc. The impact of that are supply chain suffering, political instability. The fourth one I want to add is that there's less spillover globally, right? Especially in the Western world, right? If the Western world goes into recession, developing countries that are dependent on their domestic income also go into recession. Financial insecurity about that development means those countries also go into recession, right? And I also and so what's the impact of that on the developing country? It means the developing countries are condemned to longer recoveries themselves. They're condemned to more economic downturns themselves. That's extremely harmful in their context, right? Because those people are literally facing the greatest scale of harm insofar as if they don't get. So insofar as if they don't have a job, they probably don't have government payments either. They probably can't feed their kids. It also means with an economic downturn, they're more likely going to face sectarian violence and a spillover in conflict because their governments are weak. This is the biggest harm because it affects the biggest number of people in the world, and they also face the greatest scale of impact at the point at which we can just have quicker recovery. Western governments that deal with their shit fast, that means we can impact that. Also, another mechanism for that is most foreign aid is contingent, firstly, on these governments not being in a recession so they can actually justify paying foreign aid out, but also on their domestic population being content with the idea of government taxing and government spending, at the point at which people, the working class in the community, become resentful about government taking their money for freeloaders. They're probably going to be especially resentful about foreign aid, and at that point, these countries lose out in a massive way. Firstly, just with some white, and I'll take a POI from closing to have one.
On the idea of vaccination, wouldn't people take vaccination anyway because they don't want to die?
Okay, some people take it anyway because they want to die, but a lot of people are not sure. So, for example, in America, a lot of Americans are probably in between, in the sense that they're not too sure if vaccines are dangerous or going to cause some kind of mental ailment. So their belief is, I'm just going to wait and see. And that's incredibly damaging, as we've seen in places like Florida, because this pandemic is quickly turning out to be a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Now, why is this morally justified? Just to increase the burden. We say it's morally justified because of reciprocity. This money's been forcibly taken away from working class people who might be struggling otherwise but not getting these payments. At the point at which you're taking these monies that have been forcibly taken, we think it's fair for the government, for them to expect something in reciprocity. But additionally, we actually improve the lives of those recipients, because firstly, it's important that they have work, it's important to their mental health, it's important to their long-term development, but also we also reduce stigma. We not only we win on the biggest population in the developing community, we also just win for everyone in short of recovery. We're very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker very much for the fine speech. To close the opening half, can we have the DLO whenever they're ready?
Hello. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
I'm so scared with these connections. Okay. So I will start my speech. Here we go. So the opening government's plan seems to be that this motion is to have somehow we need to save the US, and the US is going to revive through these CCTs over UCTs. And through that revival, the US is now going around the world, giving foreign aid and actually allowing other states, developing nations to survive. We think that's a very interesting way to take this debate. I'm going to prove to you why that take in itself is problematic, but also number two, about the inefficiencies of their plan going straight to their model. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the actual impacts of what happens in this debate. So firstly, let's look at their model. Their model in itself for these CCTs are quite vague. So they tell you it can be anything, as in, people who lost their jobs, people maybe send their kids to school. But here's the real thing. They're saying, oh, but there's this vaccination problem in, sorry, we're in a study room, sorry about that. We have this issue of vaccination where anti-vaxxers have this issue, but also it's not about anti-vaxxers. It's that poor people can't afford to spend their days. They can't just spend one day off. Maybe that is the case. But in that case scenario, what you're doing is this. These vaccinations already are unproven. There's already this big question of what kind of side effects they can or cannot have in their future lives. What you do under your plan is maybe $1,000, $2,000 to poor people. You change that calculus and they don't think about their long-term lives anymore, even further. They become the people that you think they are. This is exactly the government's line. Poor people only think for the short term. They should actually only do things so they don't actually plan for the long term. No, you now force them to not think about the long term. You actually run into that line, not even thinking about your own personal values, not even feeling guilty to yourself, guilty to your family. You're saying, let's get that $1,000, $2,000 because you're desperate. This is the government infringing on that individual's right, number one. Number two, you're playing with their psychologies, right? This political psychology thinking, pushing your agenda. And this is something that governments always do, which is always something that we will fight against in the government doing that. We think that's a huge problem, and that's an extreme burden that they've decided to take on the anatomy decision, on the autonomy of the individual's person. But let's say in the future that that also percolates into side effects actually happening out in the future society. What that does is now you as a government have shot yourself in the foot, because you allow people now to get even further angry at you, further prove to you about why you have created these problems, and you actually do that. What is this actually doing? You actually make these people just tests for immoral research, and you try to question, so what threshold? Is it going to be $1,000? Is it going to be $2,000? We think that's very problematic. Then they tell us, oh, but OO's problems of monitoring costs have already been proven in the developing world. No, they haven't. Monitoring costs and evaluations are huge issues, especially, this is not just, so let's take their concept of the US. If anybody who's been to the US knows that it takes months for the IRS to send you one piece of paper, it takes months for the banks to actually open your accounts when you have these situations We're also assuming in recessions, it can be pandemics and these very extreme situations. Therefore, we're telling you in the developed US, these kinds of bureaucratic issues are always problematic. How that exclusively harms the most vulnerable and the most poor is that you have to take even longer time. So those in the upper middle class, the rich people, actually have this leverage, actually have this what do you call it? Luxury to wait those days, to wait out those situations, see if these things are happening, and then they can actually see these transfers. So these people who don't need the transfers have the luxury. The people who need the transfers actually have to go through these long situations. But let's flip that around because DPM suddenly comes out and says, oh, we're also going to talk about developing countries. In these developing countries, when you don't even have Wi-Fi connections, when you, especially in rural isolated areas, when kids have to go to school, it takes literally takes 2 hours for them to walk to school in the morning. Where are you going to get these attendance rates in by the day? Where are these conditional transfers going to kick in the time that it feeds them? No, in that case scenario, we've already seen case studies in Kenya. We also seen case studies empirically done in Pakistan that prove to you that rather these conditional cash transfers, A, angers the people, B, you see actually people dying because they can't put food on the table, but 3, it doesn't bring these positive impacts. In the case of Kenya, what research found was this, that although attendance rates spiked, therefore the government had to dole out the money, schooling rates did not increase, as in the kids did not get smarter, the kids did not go into longer education. What actually happened was that it was a crisis of the infrastructure. So it's all conditional on a lot of other things already being built there. And when your state has not been built there in those developing countries, it doesn't create a problem. My previous speaker also told you from our side of the house about how this doesn't do anything for poverty reduction. In the sense of poverty reduction, CCTs also place a lot of more problems in the case that there's this artificial gloss over of you meeting these standards and you meeting these numbers, but it doesn't really create any change for these people on the ground. Furthermore, we also prove to you this, in the sense of this idea, this is going to be my extension to this debate about the actual impacts. When they say what, it actually changes perception, right? It changes impacts of what people think, because a lot of these people in the upper class and the upper middle class think poor people are, lazy, they don't want to do anything, they just want free money. Okay, number one, empirical studies in 2021 have failed to prove that actually the incentive to work is reduced, that people, when they receive these unconditional cash transfers, don't work. So it's already just a myth there. But number two is this. The problem being is that also studies have shown that alcohol, tobacco, these kinds of luxury taboo goods consumptions have actually reduced, but poor people have actually used these unconditional cash transfers to actually spend more on healthcare, spend more on education, and to spend on these things. Now, let's put that in the perspective of impacts. We're going to divide this into 3 classes of people. Number one, the active anti-stimulus person, so we should never have stimulus, those people in the middle, and those 3 who they want stimulus every single day. 1 and 3, these guys cannot be persuaded because they're on the outside. It's like a religion to them. You can't persuade them. In the middle, who are these moderates? These moderates actually see the situation. Are people poor to the situation? What kind of things do they need? If we send them to school in these rural isolated areas, will that change? It doesn't seem to be creating change for them. That condition doesn't work. Oh, should we actually put them under vaccination? Oh, but if I don't want a vaccination, is it fair to have this person not have that infringed choice either? No, in that case scenario, these moderate people who are the mass majority of the people already see that this perception cannot do anything. So the problem here links into the model, again, coming from the government side. When we actually think about what these moderates are doing in developed countries and developing countries, in that case scenario, because if they have a strong model with stringent policies, like every day you go to school, you need to have like healthcare insurance, you need to have work, all these examinations, all these evidence, then you disallow so many people from getting these cash transfers. At the same time, if their model is too weak, then you actually have a problem where everybody can just get the transfer, so it becomes a problem, right? Their model itself is not strong or weak, it's just very ideologically radical, where you actually force these people to make themselves guinea pigs for vaccines, to infringe upon their own choices, and that is why we think this does not do anything to change perception in that quality. We told you all of these benefits, we told you all of these, but we also would like to impact you in this debate that empirical studies, especially coming from our side of the house, is that already in developing nations, Pakistan, Kenya, but also in the cases of tobacco and luxury consumptions in Mexico, about how all these dropped actually when you give UCTs compared to CCTs not being proven in these case scenarios. For all these reasons, we are extremely proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank the speaker very much for that fine speech. To start the closing half, can we have the member of government whenever they're ready?
Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Time starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 observations to dismiss the opening before I get to my extension. First observation is why is OO losing? Is because the thesis of their case is that they protect individual rights. Why do they lose? Because they don't tell you why individual rights ought to be prioritized when you're in economic recession, or how is protecting individual rights actually going to make the society be much more economically sound, right? Unless there's a linkage there, I don't think they can win. But second observation is opening house main exchange about vaccination and like politicization of welfare state and the free rider problem is a wash or a deadlock in the best case scenario. We as closing can tell you more principled reason as to why government setting conditions is effective, and even if it may dictate individual freedom to a certain extent, that's the only meaningful result, that's the only meaningful change that you can be actually making during the times of recession. Because we think that the burden of the government side in this motion, which I'm about to prove with my extension, is to prove the question of why would government be justified in violating rights to a certain extent and enforce things with strings attached to solve such collective problem. So let's move on to my key unique extension on how we are able to better solve for collective change. We're going to go far better than OG in terms of actually telling you the principal reasoning as to why. Notice that in the times of recession, people may not be able to be the most rational thinking people. They're not rational. You are talking about cases in which maximizing individual rights failed. Collective action is needed via government telling people where to spend the money to. In these government programs, you often use government infrastructure and government resources, such as government job training programs, facilities already exist. Government housing programs already exist, right? This is better because of economies of scale. It is better than opposition's world of just giving unconditional cash transfer to people because A, chances are these cash transfer won't be too large to the point where people can build corporations and produce their own jobs because companies are already suffering during cases of recession. And also while government already has infrastructure to make a better usage of that, right? But then B, government has the power to preemptively provide resources and infrastructure because bureaucracy also has experience regarding which sectors may need more jobs and which sectors need to stabilize more. This means that when the LO and DLO comes up to you and talks to you about how, government's going to tell people to go to school, but then they don't have enough schools. Well, duh, the government is not going to tell those people to go to schools. Instead, government can say, why don't you build more schools in that area so that you can improve the quality of education so that like in the later generations, these people can be much more educated and like many more like, efficient workforce or whatever. But then C, government is better at spreading information and standards and setting the standards. Sure, there will be some conglomerates and businesses that may just like not want to adhere towards that, but we're talking about the general public during the times of recession. There needs to be some sort of collectivized action. Government is the only legitimized entity to be doing this. In comparison, in the world of opposition, people are making choices that are just going to maximize their own good, but not as sustainable because that's leading to further delays and actually collectivizing everyone's decisions and like interest making to solve this collective problem of recession, right? Not only do we outweigh on economics of scale, but we also outweigh on this key time frame. Sure, opposition can say bureaucracy can be ineffective in the long run, but during the times of recession, this is when the short terms of these like collectivization is absolutely needed. We think that things to be passed during times of recession in time frame is like important. And also, even if this is like happening in bipartisan countries like the US, and then like let's say like even if I do by opening government's case that like this is actually going to politicize things, we think that sure, like I mean because you're putting in much more work towards getting the like benefits, we think it's like much more like lesser of a radical sounding than the opening opposition. But then let's move on to my second piece of extension regarding how better economic recovery via psychological processes, because when people are told to be doing things, it looks like people actively looking for jobs under government or doing some kind of work. This could also link people to get other jobs, and this psychologically motivates them to be actually looking for jobs. Notice that during the COVID, there was a wave when the first year outs from college students psychological were damaged for entering into such a poor market. Why do I actually think the psychological argument actually makes a tangible difference? It's because this has a confidence value. People's and consumers' psychology actually leads to having different kinds of confidence values, and also trickles down to companies, because when they're not feeling confident, then they're not willing to actually invest in a lot of employment, right? So then therefore, we think that we provide you better types of mindset that people can be having when they enter into the job force, or at least a channel that can be used to enter the the job force. We also think that this could lead to indirect goods, such as like students are told to be attending school, doing the volunteer work, whatever. This means that the administrative in which the school is being using, the people, the teachers, they're productively working, they're able to hire more people and so on and so forth. There are also indirect benefits. Now let's engage with OO case. They need to give you OO literally just gives you arguments piecemeal about how this would maybe violate individual rights, but does not tell you how protecting individual rights actually solves recession. Because in the end, people are going to be like, that's what we really want to solve, right? They first talk about how it harms people's freedom of how to use money. Chances are things like autonomy and freedom is only recognized and important if what you're getting is not if what you're getting is incompatible with your consent. That is to say, if you did not consent into this, then it matters if someone violates my rights. However, these applicants did consent into this. They do like make a signature, and the government isn't just going to make them move to another state or like flip their life over this one thing. They're going to do this at a reasonable task. Like, for example, exactly the way that government lets volunteers know things such as approximate location of service and duration. The only reason why violation of freedom would matter if it goes against the interests of these people, we don't really think that's the case here. But then later they talk about how you artificially lead more people to go to school. I think I already dealt with this. Government can preemptively build much more infrastructures and actually plan out, actually be able to be the one that's making trade-off of like what kind of policies to enforce and what kind of people, because bureaucracy does have experience, unlike other like much more comprehensive experience over society, right? Then they talk about their increased resentment in the case if it doesn't work out. I think this is like not a round-winning argument. Like it's probably worse on a symmetric end if they say, oh, we're going to give unconditional cash transfer and it doesn't work out because they just simply do not have enough funding, right? But then the DLO comes up with this argument about alcohol and tobacco reduce when poor people are like, I don't know, like getting these like jobs or something. But then that's a matter of correlation. I'm pretty sure there's some sort of correlation statistics on how, like, I don't know, some ice cream production increasing lead is like incongruous with like the number of car accidents or something like that. And also empirical studies are cool, but then they also change all the time. Like I don't really think they can win around with like empirical arguments. And also OG, I don't really know if DPM's arguments regarding developing countries is congruent with the framework that PM is giving you, because PM states that these kind of economic recessions take 2 to 5 years. In developing countries, it obviously takes much more than that. So then there's inconsistencies in their case. Proud to be on the opposing government.
Thank the speaker very much for the fine speech. Can we have the member of opposition whenever they're ready?
My speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. The reason why the government bench loses out to today's debate is because they give you a mischaracterization, or at least insufficient characterization of what an economic recession looks like. It's going to be coming from the closing opposition, where we tell you what the reality of the is like in economic recessions, and why therefore the impact and the economic recovery that they are trying to nudge through this motion is not going to work out. And we're also going to prove to you the limitation of the choices and the
Hello, can I just stop you right there? Sarah,
is then just on government.
Sarah, can you hear
this
us?
is choppy.
Yes.
Yeah, I can
yes.
hear you. How am I here?
Yeah, so you're very choppy on I think everybody's end. Could you perhaps try to reconnect?
Yeah, I'll reconnect my wife.
Yeah, no worries.
Is that better?
Can you say just a full sentence? Anything?
Hello, my name is Sarah Yun.
Yeah, I believe that's better. Yeah, and I think you can start over because you were just at 32 seconds.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. All right, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. The government bench loses out of today's debate because they give you a misrepresentation and insufficient characterization of what an academic recession looks like. It's going to be coming from the closing opposition, where we tell you the reality of the world that people live in academic recessions and why the impact and solvency that they're trying to nudge through this motion is not going to be working, and why then that chips away from their justification to be able to curtail and limit the individual freedoms and choices of the people. Before that, some extraneous rebuttals. 1, how likely is it that people will misuse the money? Government relies on this wrong assumption that people will not have an incentive to work and an incentive to use this money correctly. First level of rebuttal is that we're literally talking about academic recessions where people's academic choices and survival is directly related and connected to people's actual physical survival. People do have an incentive to survive. People do have an incentive to not go homeless and not die. We think that there is a natural incentive for people to use the money in a way that extends their survival, and we think that that's a good purpose of this cash transfer. But second, just because people are not using the money in a way that is a result of the value ejection by the government doesn't mean that people are misusing that money, right? They're using it in ways that are more relevant to their subjective urgent needs, and we don't necessarily think that this is a bad thing. But third, we also reject this idea that the misuse of money by rich people is a very big harm, because the motion literally says that the money distribution is going to be proportionate to people's economic and wealth status, meaning that rich people are receiving little money anyway. So that the harm of people accessing investments and putting into capital is a very little harm that is going to be not very significant at the end of the day. But we also tell you that there are more serious benefits that we're able to accrue, or at least better liberties that we're able to defend on our side of the house, that are able to neglect and or at least overpower the harm that they talk about. But another thing that I'm also going to do in my constructive is talk about why the impact and solvency of this motion falls out. And we think that's really fucking important, because that is, because insofar as we're able to break down the premise, the impact does not work, then it chips away and takes away their justification for limiting and curtailing people's individual choices and freedoms. So with that deconstructed, now let's move on to the constructive that I have from closing opposition. The reality of the motion is that the priorities that the government team and the state place for these conditions are perversely misaligned with the actual and real urgent needs of the people, especially during anomalous times like academic recession. We think that during academic recession, people's urgent needs are extremely diverse to begin with, which means that it's simply difficult for the government to capture what these needs are. And especially if these governments are driven by certain agendas, then we think it's much more difficult for the government to be able to reflect and be able to capture these actual and urgent needs of the people. People need to put money into paying rent for houses and businesses so that they do not go homeless or bankrupt. People need to put money into affording their subsistence and medicine and like food and things like that. We think that these urgent needs are directly related to people's ability to survive both economically and physically. We don't think it's just about minority groups. As much as they suffer more, we think it's also about the middle class that suffers from this forced choice that they have to make. Given this context, we think it's wrong for the government to force people's economic choices in areas that are not necessarily urgent in their subjective viewpoint. We think it's wrong for the government to pursue or to force a perverse trade-off between people having to meet the conditionality versus actually serving this money into actual needs. But more importantly, unlike coming from the opening opposition, we're also going to engage with the government's best case scenario that people actually do spend the money following these conditions. The very characterization of academic recessions is that unemployment rates are skyrocketing. There's a serious chronic lack of supply in terms of quality jobs. The bankruptcy is rampant. There is no real economy to spend spend your money on. Why is this important? Because its conditionality of the transfer disregards the structural and industrial nature of what world people are living in during economic recessions. There are no jobs to apply for. There is no real economy to spend your money on. We think taking into account these circumstances that occur during economic recessions is really important because it's literally the premise upon which your conditionality of the cash transfer is reliant upon. We think this means that the government side's biggest faulty premise is that this conditionality will lead to more employment, will lead to real economy boosting and all these things. And this is also critical for them to be able to prove the benefit that economic recovery is going to be achieved on their side of the house. We don't think so. We break that promise that people still cannot get jobs. People still don't have a supply of quality jobs to be able to apply for, to be able to qualify for this type of cash transfer. We think this is important because it breaks down their premise and breaks down their mechanism for solvency. We think we also lock CG out of this debate because this justification for cutting and limiting people's individual choice is hinged upon the impact and real benefits that the government is able to derive at the expense of curtailing and limiting these freedoms. But we told you why this solvency wouldn't necessarily happen on their side of the house, and we therefore disprove their benefit principle as to why it's justified for them to, deprioritize people's individual freedoms. But we also give you further positive contribution that when we leave people to invest their money in areas that are more urgent for their needs, we think that's a better form of economic recovery because this is more approximate to recovery of the most fundamental building blocks of the economy. It's like people being able to pay for rent of the homes, people being able to, pay for mortgage, people being able to pay for their family-owned businesses and SMEs. These are fundamental building blocks of the economy that need to sustain in order to achieve an actual recovery, as opposed to this artificial weird way of putting people, or like artificial way of recovering by curtailing people's individual freedoms, which doesn't really have an impact as a result of the contextual analysis that we added to you. We think the win here is fucking clear, right? We have a more organic and unartificial recovery of the economy by not, pushing this value injection of what the government thinks is the best for the people when it's not, because we give the characterization of economic recession. But we have even a further impact of why this is bad for the resolve and the ability of the government to push for actual economic recovery policies and whatnot. The government talks about how it's important that we recover the economy in a way that leads towards, efficiency and whatnot. We think that's a fair goal, but this conditionality worsens that because the characterization of economic recessions is that often it's a failure of the government in terms of regulations and proper preventive measures to be able to actually prevent supply and trade shocks, to be able to regulate big fucking banks so that you don't have a financial crisis or an economic bubble at the end of the day. We think that one, it's morally wrong for you to burden the innocent citizens and shift the blame towards the citizens to be responsible with their forced spending to recover the economy that the government fucked up. But second, we think it's also wrong because practically, if there's a growing resentment and hatred against the government because you feel like you're burden shifting the responsibility of the citizens to recover the economy that the government did a bad job of, we think that increases the resentment, distrust, and we think that's really important because it further undermines the ability of the government to be able to push for any policies or any measures that do any good in terms of recovering the economy. And we think that we're the only team that actually gives you a real characterization of what economic recessions look like. We tell you why the impact on solvency from their side fall. But third of all, we also give you a positive contribution of why economic recovery on our side of the house is more organic, it's more progressive, and it's real. We're very, very proud to oppose this debate.
Thanks, speaker, very much for the fine speech. Can we have the government whip whenever they're ready?
Okay, also, just I'm gonna get please verbally just unmute yourself and raise. I'm gonna write it down. POI. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I also want to make some framing before moving on to the debate. I think opening government at the end kind of argues about this specific US claim about how it benefits this is really good for the economy, but also they don't provide a lot of moral justification about the actions, especially in the times of crisis. But also they kind of go about a weird case and we talk about how engaging, like they say, but people on the conservative side will probably be very angry. But I think opposition also says people will also angry when people don't have the ability to make free choices. It probably end up left as well. Therefore, I just think that's a deadlock at best. So let's go on to the most important issue in the debate, which is about how do we actually justify in a principle sense in terms of why we think rationality of an individual is limited. Secondly, why do we allow better uses of money? The CO only talks about how people are going to use this money wisely. However, our member tells you, but it's not going to be the case in which we have macro and structural changes by people giving money. We can only do this by, for example, doing things like lump sum, doing things like, for example, economies of scale, proper distribution of information, etc. Right? We told you that people actually do things, can use government resources to do things indirectly and directly. They also assume people know where they spend the money, but member of government already told you recessions are specifically a context in which they failed. Right? The effective usage of money is contingent upon this. So secondly, I want to just rebut some miscellaneous stuff from about effective monetary cost, right? I just don't think this is a case in which this policy necessarily means it's always going to be bad, because obviously you can still make improvements in your bureaucracy to make these make these monitors stronger. Also, in the case in which these are literally developing countries in which infrastructure completely lacks, it's also the case in which in this specific scenario, people are more likely to make irrational choices because compared to the bureaucrats who probably know better off, because these people probably lack a financial education, etc. So in that case, the harms also increase under your world, as long as also probably means that the more reason for this policy to be passed, right? But first of all, I want to talk about in general the principle, because notice that opening government doesn't really talk about the uniqueness of the crisis. We told you on closing government that people are inherently incapable of making these choices for all. I think this is a relevant clash when people are incapable of spending money well for themselves, because these entities not only giving them because these entities are not going to only give them jobs, but also make the people depend on it more, right? We're engaging both CO and OO because OO says people don't know how to spend. People know how to spend best for themselves. So just add some more different scenarios to prove that point. So I think it's kind of derivative, right? A. Paternalism is not something that is completely new, right? We're already full of conditionalities and status quo. We had things like, for example, welfare programs, things like, for example, what do you call it? Healthcare, all these things which already have significant amount of conditionalities. This motion is saying that we want to expand the degree of paternalism and expand the degree of limiting people's autonomy, because the crisis also means that the likelihood of people suffering also becomes greater, which means people have the possibility of A, hurting themselves, but B, also other people in their stupid, selfish actions, right? A, why do you think that is normally in the case in which it's okay for us to give this freedom, right? Because I tell you, like, people can learn from mistakes, sure, that people can have enough time to make calculations. People normally are exposed to events in which they can make rational assumptions. In times of crisis, people do not have the capabilities or chance later to learn from mistakes, because the harms are significantly irreversible. The moment you slip out and fall into a poverty trap because you literally do things like, for example, you don't look for a job because you think the crisis will pass soon. You basically have worsened off medical conditions because you don't get the medical checkups in which the government regulates. All these things and harms are likely to increase exponentially the moment in which this is going to cause your economic crises. The capacity of individuals to probably things like, for example, COVID crisis literally is a once in a century event in which people are unable to completely understand the impacts of this, compared to bureaucrats who probably know better ways in which individuals are able to solve their own problems, right? So operation assumes that rationality of information is capable, but also people can digest this. We told you on closing government, it is not a case in which not the case, and that's why we need to have people intervene. What is the impact? A, because we tell you the most vulnerable people are going to be incapable of getting proper financial education or proper education on their own. We tell you in a comparative sense, people with the expertise and the knowledge and bureaucrats are able to monitor the situation and make allocation of resources much more effective. Second of all, because if they say the harms of autonomy being harmed is their harms, right? We tell you, an individual is going to harm their own self in the future. I think the government has an obligation and justification to intervene, to prevent you from suffering future long-term harm. So I say there's a trade between a short-term autonomy of limitation of autonomy versus the long run, you end up fucking your own life up. Therefore, there's a justification of governments to do things like basically seatbelts, right? That's the principle of paternalism. C, the basic idea that your actions, selfish actions, even if you feel happy about it, is in the long term going to cause harm to other people. Because your cost, for example, doing things like, for example, increasing the cost of things like of unemployment. This is going to cause more money being spent for youth in order for you to get these poverty cap. More crime rates in general cause more government restrictions on the money that they spend. Therefore, the capabilities of governments, especially in times of crisis, to help other people out are going to be limited for your own actions. That's the reason why we justified in this specific context to justify paternalism. Before moving on, opening, what's that? Is it opening?
Yes.
Okay, sure.
We think it's extremely pernicious of you to point poor people as like stupid, selfish people, but you guys talk about these long-term medical checkups and whatnot, and then you tell us to build schools for these people. Like, how do these work in the short term? In the short term, for these individuals who can't even put food on the table, how is this even working to help the most vulnerable people, as you guys say?
Okay. So because OO says people are going to make more rational choices and therefore spend their money in good places. I'm going to tell you, even if we people are rational, why we still think it's better off, right? Because nobody's opening opposition kind of tells, oh, like, look at schools are basically ineffective. And this is a classic Milton Friedman argument that, oh, people can choose better schools and people can actually allocate their resources better off, right? It's assumed that there are infrastructures that are existing, but also they run effectively. We told you on closing government a very simple case, right? We told you, A, that even if people are rational and capable of making their own choices, why things like, for example, the economies of scale are significantly better off. We have more effective statistics because we have a government bureaucrat system that keeps track of people's common problems. You have more information that allows things like, for example, more information to keep track of problems in specific regions versus private entities lacking that information in the first place, right? We did look like things like, for example, bulk goods like textbooks contracts being much more easier because collective bargaining can happen. Look at EPS in South Korea, where public education broadcast systems are so cheaper because everyone must be forced to buy it. Notice the fact that, secondly, the issue of time frame. I told you extensively, like these industries already exist. Like these industries that they want in the future, should start in the long run. We're willing to bite the bullet that bureaucracies are inefficient in the long run. In the short run, we have the institutions versus like literally when new school is going to be built in the real world. It takes like 2, 3, 4 years, and the price is going to be done anyways. I think the capabilities of individuals to decide upon this is assumed on the premise that the benefits can transfer in the long term, sure, but then in the short term you don't have that. At least people, like for example, we have unemployment centers that have information, that gathered information and the patterns that people are suffering and able to combat these problems more effectively because they exist, because people are forced into opting into the system. We tell you that dispersible information is much more easier and cheaper because people aren't always capable of getting access to information because you assume people can and therefore make rational choices. That benefit of governments protecting, forcing people to take this means more effective allocation of resources to dispersive information could happen. All of this thing, I think, is important because even if the average individual who is probably rational enough can, in a certain, lose more off by following this policy, I think it's better off if we protect the most vulnerable people from making the most irrational decisions, also because it makes it more accessible and cheaper for these people. So I think in terms of weighing, I think it's very important for us to weigh if it is the most vulnerable people who cannot have lack education, but also the incapable of accessing these private goods. I think it must be in a more cheaper, but also maybe lesser quality infrastructure. I think it is better off for the general good of society. For all these reasons, we're proud to propose.
Thanks, Speaker, very much for the fine speech. For the last speech of the round, can we have the opposition whip whenever they're ready?
Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead.
My speech is gonna start in 3, 2, 1. Sorry for the previous speaker. Just because you don't understand what Sarah said doesn't mean that you can never engage. Only 2 things. First of all, engage with closing government why their ludicrous extension does not stand and it's unrealistic. Secondly, we'll engage with the opening government's idea of like reasons why they're also out. In the process of doing those things, we'll prove to you why CEO is the exclusive team that proved to you the actual context in which this debate operates. Look, the problem with this debate is that all 3 teams throughout the entire this 30 minutes of discussion assumes whether if people can make rational or irrational decisions. Like fucking God, who knows if I'm rational? Who knows if I'm not irrational? I'll get to the explanation separately and engage with that messy debate as well. But the point here that dismissed by the previous speech is that closing opposition shapes and identifies how the conditions and the context of the economic recession looks like, and therefore why regardless of the rationality of the individuals, the choices that the government side is forcing upon individuals is a subpar, shitty one. Let's take out closing government before anything. Firstly, they want to talk about the idea that, how do you start saying that why is individual choice more important than societal good? Like, sure, even you don't really prove that, but even if you do prove that, those choices were never given in a first place, because when you tell the people that you need to get more jobs in order to get the payment, as would you want to say, those jobs are not in there in the first place, because the first thing that companies do when recession hits is that you decide to cut the payment at best or just fire them. But let's move on to their first extension. Let's make them build schools, and this is gonna be a good way. First of all, just if you think middle class, and I don't think middle class and upper high class are going to accept the deal anyway, because they have their savings in the first place, which means that their benefits are marginal to begin with. But also secondly, we said that probably then the best case scenario is that the lower income class are going to accept this still. What is this, like neo-slavery or whatnot? I think it's incredibly harmful, especially given the fact that these minorities are already fucked up by the government. The government is the reason they created the recession. They're the reason why they created zoning law, for instance, to make sure that poor people do not have access to like freedom of economy or whatnot. And now you're telling them that you need to work. You need to work to get your right to survival during the recession. I think there's an abhorrent issue to begin with. So look, by the way, like if you put these people into construction when give them money, in the case of the United States, as your opening government sets up the context, I think the medical bill is going to be much more expensive than the money that you give out to these people. Secondly, trickle down literally dismisses the point coming from Sarah's extension, because the premise of our idea is that even in the case of schools, I think the private schools, they run out of the cash because of recession hits. The first thing that they're going to do is that even before the students actually come back, they're going to fire all the teachers and faculty members to begin with. So I have no idea how the SMEs who are really struggling to pay their rent or sustain their factory is ever going to have a trickle down effect on your side of the house to begin with. And then they want to talk about how let's engage with the idea of like people are going to get dumb. Like how? Like for instance, let's assume that we're in Korea, we're the fucking smart university debaters. Just because South Korea economy hits, like what? Do we get dumb? Do we get brain tease or whatnot? No mechanism whatsoever. But number two, Sarah told you why there's a massive physical survival incentive that hits, that makes you that not to like waste your money, but actually do things that are directly in relations to your survival. I think that is precisely important. Secondly, they talk about the schooling in the whip speech. Firstly, sure, like in the best case, you get schooling while your daddy and mommy is fired from the work and you do not have a long-term living in the first place. And secondly, we still think that it is a privilege that's given to the middle and high class. The benefits of closing government is marginal. Let's engage with the opening government. Prime Minister, they want to talk about the idea like people don't want to work. I'm sorry, if you look into the Asian financial crisis, people kill themselves because they wanted work, but the companies would not accept them because that's the nature of recession. Number two, they want to talk about the idea of like we get to solve recession, you know, like because like, well, what is this? Like more money to spend or whatever. First of all, usage of money exists on both sides of the house. It's the comparative is not as if stipend versus non-stipend. If anyone's adding more barriers, it is onto your side of the house. What you're doing is that if you're, for instance, Black person living in ghetto, who cannot get to the main city, who did not have education, who has to face multi-layer of discrimination and barriers on your side of the house, you're forcing these people to take up responsibilities that are infinite and cannot ever be met. Let's take one from opening government.
Ideally, we'd want future support to be enough for recipients to be comfortable enough to cause the labour shortages we see now. So surely not pissing off the working class and business owners and having conservative that slash spending is probably an important goal.
Okay, if the judge is fair enough, I think you're going to understand that does not engage with any of the things that we're saying in the debate. The comparative is survival, probably get money on either side of the house. The absence of barrier means that more people have access to money, disposable income, that they can use it for their own interest. You're out of this debate. Thirdly, let's talk about this idea of like Americanization is a thing. There's a perception for like you're a free rider or whatnot. Couple of reasons. Firstly, I don't think it's fair for them to just pin the case and have a narrow vision saying that America is the only case. Number two, as Oo said, probably conservatives going to hate the policy anyways because they just don't like government giving out money. Thirdly, that's empirically not true. Look at US, UK, France, Korea, Germany. All of these countries are doing fine job in terms of providing stipends. And guess what? Economy is getting very well during the case of COVID-19. So empirically, you're not true. Probably CG does not like empirical evidences, but sorry, Hiram, you need empirical evidences to win the debate. Okay, they want to talk about this idea that there will be a stigmatization, like minorities are not doing anything. We think that's going to be worse on your side of the house because the conservative narrative on the opening government is going to be, we as the big father government gave you the money, gave you the opportunity, but you're not doing anything when the conditions were not given in the first place. So we think if anything, if conservatives are these well-intentioned people to frame out minorities and say that you're a free rider, you strengthen that narrative. Even in this, because the exact problem here is that those conditions were not given out to you. The American government created zoning laws. For instance, the disability people in South Korea do not have the government's funding schools for disabled specialized individuals. That's the exact problem at the end of the day. What is the actual comparative and contribution that CG brings out here? The problem with opening opposition here is that they talk about how recession is bad, like minorities are going to be harmed, but they never analyze how the recession actually looks like. But even in the case of those moderate, non-extreme minority cases, why the choices are never given out to you. That's the first contribution that Sarah gives out to you. Secondly, she also told you about why we get to provide money into fundamental aspects. The
Here,
SMEs, middle corporations that take up more than 50% of the economy can now be sustained on our set of tiles exclusively. Third and finally, the trust of the individual government.
Here,
Probably during the times of recession, you need to have further planning in the governance. But the moment you say burden push individuals, saying that you need to be responsible for rebuilding the society by building fucking stupid schools, when it is the government that failed to regulate the Wall Streets or whatever, we think it harms the ability for any democratic mandate to agree with anything that the central government will be doing. This is an extremely clear win for the closing opposition.
I thank the speaker for the fine speech. Thank you everyone for a wonderful round.